In the unforgiving heart of the West, a single moment can define a life, and a single choice can echo through generations. This is a story of how a glass of whiskey didn't just buy a girl's freedom, but tested the very soul of a gunslinger, leading to a reckoning that would stain the dusty streets with more than just spilled liquor. Where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments below. And if you believe in stories of courage and redemption, support our channel and settle in for what comes next. The air in Barlow's saloon was a thick, layered thing, smelling of stale beer, unwashed bodies, and the quiet desperation of Wyoming. 1869. It was a sound, too, the low murmur of prospectors, the sharp click of poker chips, and the weary shuffle of moccasins on sawdust-covered floors. Here, on the raw edge of civilization, the Apache were not a people. They were a commodity. They cleaned the spittoons, hauled the ice, and served the whiskey that fueled the town's slow decay, all for the meager privilege of not being driven from the scrubland their ancestors had called home for centuries. Tsela moved through this haze like a ghost. At 19, she possessed a stillness that was often mistaken for submission. It was not. It was the rigid control of a dam holding back a river of grief and rage. Her movements were economical, her face a mask of stoicism chiseled by a pain too deep for tears. She worked here, in this den of casual cruelty, so that her grandmother and young brother could eat, so that the land agent would look the other way. Every glass she filled felt like a betrayal of her blood, a stain on her spirit, and the whispers of traitor from her own people followed her, like a shadow. The man who slammed his empty glass on the bar was Silas Croft, a mine owner whose wealth was matched only by his sadism. His face was a fleshy map of indulgence, his eyes small and piggy, glittering with a casual malice. "Girl," he grunted, his voice a gravelly rumble. "Whiskey, and be quick about it." Tsela's hands, usually so steady, paused over the rows of bottles. She had served Croft before. She had seen the way he looked at her, the way his knuckles would whiten when he grabbed a girl's arm. But tonight was different. Tonight, the ghost of her grandfather, a man who had warned that the white man's firewater was a poison for the soul, stood beside her. She looked at Croft's bloated face and saw the embodiment of every desecration her people had suffered. Quietly, she shook her head. No. The saloon didn't fall silent. It held its breath. The murmur of conversation snagged. The poker chips froze in midair. Barlow, the proprietor, a man whose spine was made of greed, looked up from his ledger, his eyes narrowing. Croft's face darkened, a tide of crimson rising from his thick neck. "What did you say to me, you savage cur?" "I will not serve you," Tsela repeated, her voice low but clear, a single defiant bell toll in the suffocating quiet. The slap was a crack of lightning. It snapped her head to the side, stinging her cheek with a white-hot fire. She tasted blood. She stumbled back, catching herself on the edge of the bar. But her eyes, when she raised them, were still unbroken. They burned with a cold, ancient fire. "You worthless piece of property," Croft snarled, raising his hand again. "You'll do as you're told, or I'll—" "How much?" The voice came from the corner, calm and quiet, yet it cut through the tension like a razor. Every head turned. A man sat there, half shrouded in shadow, a dusty hat pulled low over his eyes. He hadn't been there a moment ago. It seemed. He was lean, dressed in worn leather, the handle of a Colt peacemaker visible at his hip. There was a weariness about him, a stillness that mirrored Tsela's, but his was the stillness of a predator, not prey. This was Daniel. Barlow scurried over, wiping his greasy hands on his apron. "How much for what, stranger?" "For her," Daniel said, his gaze fixed on Tsela. The man wants his whiskey. She won't serve him. It seems there's a dispute over services. So, I'll pay her debt. How much for her time? For the bottle? For the inconvenience?" He tossed a heavy gold coin onto the bar. It spun, catching the lamplight, a small sun in the gloom. Barlow's eyes widened. The coin was more than enough to cover a week's worth of whiskey, let alone a single glass. He snatched it up before Croft could object. "The lady is compensated," Barlow declared, nodding at Daniel. Croft glared, but there was something in the stranger's posture, in the way his hand rested near his gun, that spoke a language of finality Croft understood. He grumbled, but backed away, finding another girl to pour his drink. The saloon exhaled, the noise resuming its rhythm. Tessella stood frozen, her cheek throbbing. She looked at the man in the corner, this Daniel, with a mixture of confusion and suspicion. He had saved her from a second blow, but he had also just participated in the grim commerce of her life, putting a price on her defiance. Daniel stood and walked to the bar. He picked up the clean glass and the bottle of whiskey. He poured a single measure, the amber liquid catching the light. Then, he slid the glass across the polished wood until it stopped directly in front of Sella's hand. His eyes, deep-set and haunted, met hers. "Now," he said, his voice a low command that was for her and her alone, "serve me." The glass sat between them, a small circle of amber fire on the dark wood. It was a crucible, to Sella. It contained more than whiskey. It held the humiliation of the slap, the sting of her people's scorn, the crushing weight of her servitude. For a long moment, she didn't move. Her mind, a whirlwind of fury and fear, settled into a cold, hard clarity. This man, Daniel, had not saved her. He had simply purchased the right to test her himself. He had paid for her defiance only to demand her submission. Her hand, when it moved, was perfectly steady. Her fingers did not tremble. She picked up the glass, the coolness of it a stark contrast to the fire on her cheek. She held Daniel's gaze, a silent conversation passing between them in the space of a heartbeat. His eyes were not cruel like Croft's, nor greedy like Barlow's. They were something far more complex, weary, searching, and filled with a familiar shadow of loss. She saw a flicker of something she recognized, the look of a soul that had also been fractured. With deliberate, almost ceremonial grace, she lifted the glass and placed it in front of him, exactly where he had been standing. Her touch was light, her movement fluid. It was an act of service, but it was not an act of surrender. Her unwavering eyes said, "This is a transaction, as you arranged. It is nothing more." Daniel watched her every move. He had expected fear, or tears, or perhaps a new, more violent outburst of defiance. He had not expected this profound, contained dignity. He watched her place the glass down, and his own test was answered. Her will was not broken. It was forged in a fire he was only beginning to understand. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, a sign of respect that was more valuable to her than the gold coin he'd thrown on the bar. He did not drink the whiskey. He turned, gesturing with his head toward the back door of the saloon. "Walk," he said, his voice low. Suspicion warred with a nascent curiosity in Sella's heart. To follow a strange white man into the darkness was a fool's errand, an invitation to disaster. But to stay was to face Barlow's wrath and Croft's lingering leer. She made her choice, wiping the single streak of blood from her lip with the back of her hand. She followed him, moving silently through the kitchen, past the hanging carcasses of rabbits and the smell of boiled potatoes, and out into the biting cold of the Wyoming night. The alley was a narrow channel of mud and refuse between the saloon and the assayer's office. The moon was a sliver of bone in a black sky. Daniel stopped, turning to face her. In the dim light, the lines on his face seemed deeper. "Barlow," he began, his voice stripped of the saloon's pretense. "He's the rot in this town, but he's just the face of it." Zella remained silent, her arms crossed against the cold, waiting. "He's running more than a saloon," Daniel continued, his eyes scanning the darkness as if expecting an attack. "He's got the land agent in his pocket. He forces your people into debt, takes their ancestral lands as payment, and then sells the timber rights to the railroad. He uses this saloon to keep everyone drunk and broken, too weak to fight back." Zella's heart gave a painful throb. It was the story of her people, spoken aloud by a stranger. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice raspy. "Because I saw you," he said, his gaze returning to her face. "I saw you say no. It takes more than courage to do that in there. It takes a reason." He paused, and for a moment, the gunslinger's mask slipped, revealing a raw vulnerability. "Someone used the same methods. Debt, whiskey, a crooked agent, to take my family's homestead, to take my sister." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The single word sister hung in the cold air, heavy with unspoken grief. Here it was, the common ground, the shared geography of loss. Zella looked at this man, at the way his hand instinctively rested on the butt of his Colt, not as a threat, but as a habit born of pain. He was a man shaped by the same kind of injustice that was slowly strangling her. She still didn't trust him. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. But she understood him. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "I'm going to burn Barlow's world to the ground," Daniel said, his voice a low fire. "But I can't do it alone. He watches me. He expects a man with a gun. He doesn't expect a girl who serves his drinks. You see things. You hear things. You can move where I can't." He was asking her to be a spy, to walk back into the place of her humiliation and become a weapon. It was a dangerous, perhaps fatal proposition. But as she stood there, the cold seeping into her bones, she thought of her young brother, of her grandmother's fading eyes, of a future that was nothing more than an endless series of whiskey glasses and casual cruelties. Daniel was offering not safety, but a chance for a reckoning. She didn't offer a verbal agreement. Words were cheap. Instead, she unclasped a small bracelet from her wrist. It was made of worn leather and a single polished river stone, a keepsake from her father. She held it out to him. It was a gesture of collateral, a promise. Daniel looked at the simple object in her palm, then back at her face. He understood. He didn't take it. "Keep it," he said softly. "You'll need a reminder of who you're fighting for." He nodded once, a compact sealed in the silent, frozen alley. A fragile trust had been forged, not with promises, but with the shared weight of ghosts. The nights that followed were a quiet torment for Daniel. Sleep offered no escape, only a different kind of wilderness to navigate. In his small airless room at the boarding house, the smell of boiled cabbage and lye soap a constant presence, he would be plunged back into the past. The dream was always the same. It wasn't a memory, but a living thing, a wound that refused to scar over. It began with the scent of pine and the warm, golden light of late summer on his family's land in the Ohio Valley. He saw his sister, Sarah, her hair the color of corn silk, chasing butterflies in a field of wildflowers. She was 14, all sharp elbows and a laugh that could startle birds from the trees. He was her protector, her older brother, the one who was supposed to keep the world at bay. The dream would then curdle. The golden light would turn a sickly orange, the scent of pine replaced by the acrid smell of smoke, men on horseback, Not soldiers, but something worse. Land grabbers, their faces hard and pitiless, led by a man with a jagged scar that ran through his left eyebrow. They carried papers, legal documents reeking of fraud, backed by the authority of a half-drunk agent. His father argued. His mother pleaded. Daniel, only 17 himself, stood with a pitchfork in his hands, a useless talisman against their rifles. The dream always ended in a cacophony of shouting, the shattering of glass, and Sarah's scream. He would see her face, pale with terror, as the man with the scar grabbed her arm. Daniel had lunged forward, but someone had struck him from behind. He'd woken up with his head split open, his home burning, and his family gone. His parents were dead. Sarah was never seen again. The man who orchestrated it all, the man who had profited from their ruin, was a man he'd later learned had moved west to start anew. A man who now owned a saloon in Wyoming. A man named Barlow. He would wake up in a cold sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs, the name Sarah, a ghost on his lips. His quest for revenge was not a cold, calculated thing. It was a fever that had burned in him for years, leaving him hollowed out, capable only of this one, all-consuming purpose. This was the engine that drove him. The reason he could look at Tsela and see not a savage, but a reflection of a battle he had already lost once. He would not lose it again. Meanwhile, Tsela's days were a tightrope walk over a chasm of suspicion. She returned to the saloon, her cheek bruised but her head held high. Barlow had sneered at her, docked her pay for the trouble she'd caused, but he needed the workers, so he let her stay. She moved through the room, her ears open, her eyes missing nothing. She learned to filter the noise, to pick out the names of land parcels from drunken conversations, to note which prospectors paid their tabs with nuggets of gold, and which signed their debts away to Barlow with a shaky hand. Her true trial, however, came not from within the saloon's walls, but from outside them. One afternoon, as she gathered dried herbs by the creek bed, 2 women from her own tribe approached her. They were elders, their faces etched with the harsh lines of judgment. "The daughter of the people serves the men who steal our land," the first one said, her voice laced with contempt. "You shame the memory of your father," the second one spat. "You wear the dirt of their world on your skin. You are no longer one of us." The words were stones, each one striking a place already bruised. They couldn't know her reasons. They couldn't see the desperate gamble she was taking. They saw only the surface, a girl who had bent her knee. Tsela stood before them, the herbs falling from her numb fingers, and felt an isolation more profound than any she had ever known. She was an exile in 2 worlds, fighting for a people who had cast her out. She said nothing, merely watched them turn their backs on her, the silent condemnation a heavier blow than Croft's open violence. That evening, she met Daniel at their prearranged spot, a grove of cottonwoods downstream from the town. The sun was setting, bleeding purple and orange across the horizon. She was quiet, her inner turmoil a palpable force. Daniel, fresh from the grip of his own nightmares, recognized the look in her eyes. It was the look of someone who had been cut adrift. He didn't press her for information. Instead, he pointed to a hawk circling high above them. "My father used to say they have the best view," he said, his voice quiet. "They see the whole story. The hunter, the hunted. They don't take sides." Tsela followed his gaze, watching the hawk's effortless glide. "To us," she said softly. "The hawk is a messenger. It sees the truth." "What truth does it see today?" Daniel asked gently. A single tear, hot and traitorous, escaped and traced a path through the dust on her cheek. "It sees a girl who is a stranger to her own blood," she whispered. Daniel's gaze softened with a deep, aching empathy. He understood the price of being an outcast, of being driven by a purpose others could not see. "They hate you for trying to survive in a world they didn't make," he said, the words an echo of his own experience. "I know the feeling." In that moment, a new understanding formed between them. It was not built on plans or strategies, but on the shared pain of their respective exiles. He was haunted by a ghost sister. She was scorned by a living people. Both were utterly alone, except, perhaps, for each other. He saw her not as a tool for his revenge, but as a fellow survivor. And she saw him not as a white man, but as a soul marked by a grief as deep as her own. The fragile understanding between them solidified into a shared purpose. Their clandestine meetings by the cottonwood grove became less about shared sorrows and more about a concrete plan. Daniel, piecing together the whispers Zella brought him with his own observations, confirmed his target. It was a large, leather-bound ledger that Barlow kept locked in his office. It wasn't just an account book, it was his confession. "Everything's in there," Daniel explained one night, the moonlight filtering through the leaves to dapple their faces. "The illegal land transfers, the names of the officials he's bribed, the crushing debts he's used to enslave your people. It's more than proof, it's a weapon. With that book, we can turn this whole town, even the federal marshals, against him. We don't just get revenge, we get justice." Zella listened, her heart a steady, determined drumbeat. Justice. The word felt foreign on her tongue, a concept that belonged to the white man's world of courts and papers. For her people, there was only survival. But Daniel's words planted a seed of a different possibility, a future where the wrongs were not just endured, but righted. "The office is locked," she stated, her mind already working, picturing the layout of the saloon. "Barlow keeps the key on a chain around his neck." "I can't get near it," Daniel said, frustration coloring his tone. "Since the night with Croft, he watches me every second I'm in there. His men follow me when I leave. But you—" He let the sentence hang in the air. The implication was clear. He was a gunslinger, a known threat. They expected violence from him. But her, she was just the Apache girl, invisible, part of the furniture. She could clean the hallway outside the office, wait for a moment of distraction, slip inside. The plan was simple in its design and terrifying in its execution. "He's a light sleeper," Zella said, thinking of the cot in the back of the office where Barlow sometimes passed out. The floorboards creak. "I know," Daniel said grimly. "I can create a diversion at the front of the saloon, a staged fight, something to draw everyone's attention, even for a minute. That's all the time you'll have." The weight of the decision settled upon her. This was no longer about a silent act of defiance. This was a direct confrontation, an act of theft that, if discovered, would mean a swift and brutal death. She thought of her grandmother's frail hands, of her brother's trusting face. Was she gambling their lives for a chance at this thing Daniel called justice? She looked at Daniel, at the unyielding fire in his eyes, and saw the answer. The slow death of servitude was no life at all. To do nothing was to guarantee her brother would inherit this same poisoned existence. The risk was terrifying, but the alternative was unbearable. "Tonight," she said, her voice firm. "There's a big poker game. The territorial senator is in town. Barlow will be distracted by him, trying to curry favor." The hours leading up to the attempt were the longest of Zella's life. Every tick of the clock in the saloon was a countdown. She served drinks, her hands steady, her face an unreadable mask, while inside, her nerves were screaming. She watched Barlow, a fat spider in the center of his web, laughing with the senator, the brass key to his office glinting on its chain against his sweat-stained shirt. Just after midnight, she saw Daniel enter the saloon. He ordered a beer, positioning himself near two loud-mouthed trappers known for their short tempers. He exchanged a glance with Tsela, a look that was both a warning and a promise. "Get ready." Tsela picked up her bucket and mop, making her way toward the back hallway that led to Barlow's office. Her heart was a frantic bird beating against her ribs. She could hear the drone of conversation, the clink of glasses. Then, a sudden crash from the main room. Shouts erupted. "You cheating son of a—" It was Daniel's diversion. She heard the thud of a body hitting a table, the splintering of wood, men yelling. This was her chance. With trembling fingers, she pulled a small, thin piece of metal from her sleeve, a lockpick Daniel had given her, something she'd practiced with for hours on old, rusted locks. She inserted it into the keyhole of Barlow's office. Her hands were slick with sweat. The lock wouldn't give. The shouting from the saloon grew louder. Barlow was roaring orders. "Come on," she prayed, to which gods she didn't know. She applied pressure, twisted, and felt a faint click. The door swung inward into darkness. She slipped inside, closing it silently behind her. The room smelled of cigar smoke and stale whiskey. Moonlight streamed through the single window, illuminating the heavy oak desk. She saw it immediately, the thick, leather-bound ledger. Her hands reached for it, her fingers brushing the worn cover. It felt heavier than stone, weighted with the lives it had ruined. Suddenly, she heard heavy, stomping footsteps in the hall. It was Barlow. He was coming back, his rage from the fight propelling him toward the sanctuary of his office. There was nowhere to hide. Tsela's breath caught in her throat. She clutched the ledger to her chest, her back pressed against the wall, and braced for the door to burst open, for the end to finally come. The doorknob rattled violently. Tsela's world shrank to the space of a single, panicked heartbeat. She was trapped. The ledger in her hands felt like a tombstone, but the door didn't open. From the hallway, she heard Barlow cursing, fumbling with the key on his chain. In that split second of delay, her survival instincts, honed by a lifetime of navigating threats, took over. Her eyes darted around the dark room and found her only hope, the tall, narrow window behind the desk. It was a straight drop to the muddy alley below. Without a second thought, she scrambled onto the desk, her moccasins making no sound. She fumbled with the window latch. It was stiff with rust and disuse. As Barlow's key finally scraped into the lock, the latch gave way. Tsela shoved the window open, clutched the heavy ledger to her chest, and threw herself into the darkness just as the office door swung inward. She landed hard in the muck and filth of the alley, the impact jarring her bones and forcing the air from her lungs. For a moment, she lay there, gasping, the ledger a hard, protective shield against her ribs. Above, she heard Barlow roar in fury as he saw the open window and his empty desk. Lights appeared. Men were shouting. She couldn't stay here. Scrambling to her feet, ignoring the sharp pain in her ankle, she clutched the book and melted into the deeper shadows of the night, her escape a miracle of timing and desperation. She found Daniel an hour later at the Cottonwood Grove, a grim specter emerging from the darkness. He took one look at her mud-caked form, the wild look in her eyes, and the precious ledger in her arms, and knew both that she had succeeded and that something had gone terribly wrong. "He knows," she gasped, handing him the book. He was at the door. Daniel's face was grim as he took the ledger. "A lackey must have seen you slip away during the fight. I didn't count on that." He looked at her ankle, which she was now favoring heavily. "You're hurt." "I'll live," she said. But a new cold dread was creeping into her. Barlow was not a man to accept a simple defeat. His revenge would be swift and cruel. "My family," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "Daniel. He'll go after my family. His face, already etched with the ghosts of his own past, tightened. This was it. The moment he had been dreading. His plan, his obsession, had once again placed an innocent family in the path of a monster. The face of his sister, Sarah, flickered in his mind's eye. "We go now," he said, his voice hard as stone, but they were too late. When they reached the cluster of crude dwellings at the edge of town where Sella's family lived, the small cabin was dark and silent. The door hung open, a gaping wound. Inside, a stool was overturned. A woven blanket lay trampled on the dirt floor. Her grandmother and her 12-year-old brother were gone. On the table, held down by a rock, was a piece of paper. The message was simple and brutal. The book for the old woman and the boy. Red Canyon at sunrise. Come alone. The guilt that crashed over Daniel was a physical force. He had seen this before. He had lived this before. He had tried to be a savior, and had become the catalyst for the very horror he sought to avenge. He looked at Sella's face, a mask of anguish in the moonlight, and saw his own failure reflected in her eyes. "This is my fault. Sella," he said, his voice raw. "I brought this upon you." She turned to him, and there was no accusation in her gaze, only a terrifying, focused fire. "Fault doesn't matter now," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "Getting them back is all that matters. You lost your sister. I will not lose my brother." Her words were a shard of glass in his heart, both a condemnation and a call to arms. The ride to Red Canyon was a silent, desperate journey. The landscape, bathed in the pre-dawn's gray light, was alien and menacing. The canyon walls rose around them like ancient, blood-red teeth. They were riding into a trap, and they both knew it. Daniel had the ledger tucked into his saddlebags, but his mind was racing, trying to find a way out of this impossible choice, the evidence that could bring down an empire, or the lives of the only family Sella had left. They saw them at the canyon mouth. Barlow was there with Silas Croft and a half-dozen hired guns. Sella's grandmother stood with quiet dignity, while her brother, Kai, tried to mask his terror. "The Gunslinger," Barlow called out, his voice echoing off the rock walls. "I knew you wouldn't have the stomach to come alone. Throw me the book, and you can have what's left of them." Daniel dismounted, holding his hands up in a gesture of peace, but his eyes were a storm of calculation. He saw the positions of Barlow's men, the fear in Kai's eyes, the weariness on Sella's grandmother's face. This could not be a simple trade. Barlow would never honor it. "The book is right here, Barlow," Daniel shouted back, pulling the ledger from his bag. "But you and I both know you're not a man of your word." He then did something unexpected. He opened the ledger and began to read aloud, his voice ringing through the canyon. "Page 42. Payments made to Silas Croft for falsifying or quality reports to cheat his investors." Croft's face went pale. His men stirred uneasily. "Page 58. Daniel continued, his voice rising. "A list of debts for the men standing with you, with interest rates triple what you told them." Now the hired guns were looking at each other, then at Barlow, their loyalty beginning to fray. Daniel wasn't just using the ledger as a bargaining chip. He was using it as a weapon, sowing discord in the enemy's ranks. It was the opening they needed. In that moment of confusion, Sella, who had slipped off her horse unnoticed, let out a piercing cry, a hawk's screech that echoed strangely in the canyon. It was a signal she had arranged with her brother, a sound from their childhood games. Kai reacted instantly, stomping hard on the foot of the man holding him and bolting toward a cluster of rocks. All hell broke loose. Barlow, enraged, fired a shot not at Daniel, but at the fleeing boy. But Daniel was already moving, his Colt seeming to leap into his hand. His shot was true, striking the gun from Barlow's grasp. The canyon erupted in a chaotic firefight, bullets ricocheting off the stone walls. Daniel, no longer just a man of vengeance, but a protector, laid down covering fire, fighting with a desperate clarity he hadn't felt in years, determined that this time history would not be repeated. The firefight in Red Canyon was short, brutal, and indecisive. In the chaos, as Barlow's now distrustful men fought with more concern for their own skin than for their employer, Zella managed to reach her brother and grandmother, pulling them into the relative safety of the rocks. Daniel, using the confusion he'd sown, wounded Croft and forced Barlow into a humiliating retreat. They escaped, but they left 2 of their men dead and their alliance shattered. Barlow, wounded in the arm where Daniel's bullet had grazed him, fled back toward the one place he still controlled, his saloon. Daniel and Zella got her family to the relative safety of the Cottonwood Grove, their temporary sanctuary. The relief was immense, but short-lived. The ledger was safe, but Barlow was still free, a wounded snake who would only become more venomous. They all knew this wasn't over. The final confrontation had only been delayed. "He'll be waiting for us at the saloon," Daniel said, cleaning his Colt with grim precision. "It's his fortress." "Then we will not let him rest in it," Zella replied. Her fear had been burned away, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. She had seen her brother nearly killed, had tasted the metallic tang of a final battle. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a warrior. As if on cue, the sky began to change. The clear, cold air grew heavy and dark. Bruised-looking clouds rolled in from the mountains. A storm was coming. The wind picked up, whipping through the cottonwoods, its mournful howl a fitting soundtrack for the night ahead. It was a sign. The sky itself was ready for a cleansing. They didn't wait for the storm to break. They rode back into town under the cover of the gathering gloom. The streets were empty, the townspeople having sensed the charged atmosphere and barricaded themselves indoors. The saloon was lit up, an island of defiant light against the encroaching darkness. This time, they didn't go in the front door. Their combined knowledge was their greatest weapon. Zella knew the saloon's secret paths, the loose floorboard in the pantry that led to the cellar. Daniel, having studied the ledger, knew Barlow's personal habits, the hidden derringer taped under his main poker table, the back staircase he used as an escape route. They slipped into the cellar, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and aging whiskey. As the first fat drops of rain began to hammer on the roof above, they ascended into the heart of the saloon. Barlow was there, as expected, pacing behind the bar with a shotgun, his arm in a crude sling. A few of his most loyal, or most desperate, men were scattered around the room, their faces tense. The final act began not with a gunshot, but with a voice. "It's over, Barlow," Daniel said, stepping out from the shadows of the kitchen doorway. Zella emerged from the hall, not with a weapon, but holding a lantern high, its light casting long, dancing shadows. Barlow laughed, a ragged, unhinged sound. "Over? It's just getting started. Gunslinger. You took my book, but you can't take my town." "It was never your town," Zella said, her voice ringing with newfound authority. "You just poisoned it." The confrontation was public, witnessed by the handful of terrified workers and Barlow's wavering men. It was no longer just Daniel's quest for his sister or Zella's fight for her family. It was a public reckoning. As the storm broke outside, thunder rattling the windows, Daniel spoke the name that had haunted him for years. "You took everything from me." In Ohio. A girl named Sarah. Barlow's face, for the first time, showed a flicker of genuine shock, of memory. The scar above his eye, the one from Daniel's dream, seemed to deepen. "That was business," he spat. "You called my sister business?" Daniel said, his voice dangerously low. "Tonight, I'm here to settle the account." As he spoke, one of Barlow's men, positioned on the staircase, raised his rifle to shoot Daniel in the back. But before he could fire, Tyrella acted. With a cry, she hurled the lantern. It shattered against the wall near the gunman, engulfing the bottom of the staircase in a sudden whoosh of flame. Panic erupted. The final fight was a maelstrom of violence inside the storm. Gunshots mixed with thunder. The smoke of black powder mingled with the smoke from the growing fire. In the chaos, Barlow scrambled for the shotgun on the bar. He brought it up, aiming it squarely at Daniel. But Sella was closer, in a moment that brought her story full circle. Her hand closed around the neck of a whiskey bottle on the bar, the same brand Croft had demanded. It was not a symbol of servitude anymore. It was a weapon. With all her strength, she swung, smashing the heavy glass bottle against the side of Barlow's head. He staggered, disoriented, his shot going wide and blasting a hole in the ceiling. That single moment of distraction was all Daniel needed. His Colt barked once. The shot was clean. Final. Barlow collapsed behind the bar he had ruled for so long, his reign of poison over. The remaining henchmen, seeing their leader fall, threw down their weapons as the fire began to lick its way up the walls. The saloon, the symbol of so much pain, was cleansing itself with fire. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived. By dawn, all that was left of Barlow's saloon was a blackened, skeletal frame, steam and smoke rising from the smoldering ruins to greet the clean, rain-washed air. The fire, having consumed the source of the town's decay, had died out, prevented from spreading by the deluge. The bodies had been carried away, and a stunned but palpable quiet had settled over the street. Justice, it seemed, smelled of wet ash and new beginnings. Sella and Daniel sat by the creek at the edge of the cottonwood grove, the same place where their fragile alliance had been formed. The sun was rising, painting the eastern sky in delicate shades of rose and gold. The world felt new, raw. They were both wounded. Daniel had a crude bandage around his forearm where a splinter from the shotgun blast had sliced him open. Sella was tending to a long, shallow cut on his cheek with a cloth dipped in the cold, clear water of the creek. They didn't speak for a long time. There were no words necessary for the shared trauma of the night, for the violent catharsis they had endured. The silence between them was no longer one of suspicion or strategy, but of profound, shared experience. They were bound together now by scars, both visible and invisible. A UISS. Marshall, drawn to the town by the news of Barlow's long-overdue demise, had taken Daniel's statement and the scorched but still legible ledger. The book would do its work now, unraveling the web of corruption that had held the territory in its grip for so long. Silas Croft was in custody. The land agent had fled. The legal machinery of justice had finally begun to turn. But for Daniel and Sella, the true war was already over. Sella finished cleaning the cut on Daniel's cheek. Her touch was gentle, her focus absolute. He watched her, seeing not the timid saloon girl from a few days ago, but a woman of formidable strength and quiet grace. She had saved him in that saloon as surely as he had saved her. "Your family is safe," he said, his voice quiet. "Kai. He's a brave kid, aye. He learned it from our grandmother," Sella replied, a faint smile touching her lips for the first time. "She says the tribe's elders came to see her this morning. They no longer call me traitor. They call me a warrior." Her name was not just cleared, it was remade. But she knew. As she looked down at her own scraped and bruised hands, that she was no longer the same person who had sought their approval. She had found her own honor, in her own way. Daniel nodded, a weight seeming to lift from his shoulders. His quest for vengeance was done. The ghost of his sister, Sarah, no longer screamed in his nightmares. He had not brought her back, but he had honored her memory. He had prevented her story from being repeated. For the first time in years, the fire in his gut had cooled to a quiet ember. He stood up, his movements stiff. His horse was saddled nearby, waiting patiently. His purpose in this town was fulfilled. It was time to move on. That was the life he knew. Tsella stood with him. She watched him check the saddlebags, his movements full of a familiar wanderer's restlessness. The open road called to him. "Where will you go?" she asked. "Don't know," he answered honestly. "West, I suppose. There's always more west." He paused, turning to face her fully. The morning sun caught the weariness and the newfound peace in his eyes. "Come with me," he said. The words were simple, unplanned, spoken from a place of quiet hope he didn't know he still possessed. Tsella looked at him, then past him, at the vast open road that disappeared into the horizon. Behind her was her family, her people, a home reclaimed. Before her was a future unknown, a path alongside the man who saw her, who fought beside her, who shared her scars. She didn't give him an answer. She didn't need to. Not yet. She simply met his gaze, and in her eyes, he saw not an ending, but the possibility of a new chapter. For two souls who had been defined by loss and isolation for so long, the quiet hope of a shared sunrise was more than enough. The West is a vast and lonely country, a place that tests the soul and marks it with scars. These scars can be a record of pain, a map of all that has been lost to the unforgiving dust. Or they can be a testament to survival. They can be a reminder that a wound, once healed, makes the place stronger than it was before. For Tsella and Daniel, their journey was never truly about revenge against one man. It was a fight for something far more fundamental, the reclamation of their own dignity. In a world that tried to define them by their losses, a lost sister, a lost home, a lost honor, they discovered that true strength isn't found in the refusal to bend, but in the courage to rise after being broken. The greatest battles are rarely fought with bullets and blades. They are fought in the quiet wilderness of the human heart, the struggle to forgive others, the fight to be forgiven, and the hardest war of all, the long campaign to forgive oneself. Tsella and Daniel didn't just defeat an enemy, they earned a fragile peace within themselves. Their story, like so many others, now fades into the immense landscape, a quiet testament to the enduring truth that even in the harshest territory, compassion and courage can take root, and that every sunrise offers a new, open road.